Shalom, everyone, and Chag Shavuot Sameach. Good Sabbath and a happy festival of Shavuot to you all. Today's sermon is entitled The Shavuot Fire Covenant of Torah and Spirit. It's regarding the law and loving kindness lessons learned from Ruth. Now, Shavuot, also called Shavuos, or Pentecost in English from the Greek meaning 50, was originally an ancient harvest festival celebrating the grain crop. In Hebrew, Shavuot means weeks and also means sevens. The holiday is celebrated 7 weeks after Passover begins. But Shavuot is also recognized as the anniversary of the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, and most Shavuot celebrations are centered on Torah study. On the first night of the holiday, many people stay up all night studying Torah. There is a custom of eating dairy foods, especially cheesecakes and blintzes, on Shavuot. And the reason for this tradition is not entirely clear, but one popular explanation is that immediately after the Israelites received the Torah and learned about the laws of keeping kosher, it was too complicated for them to begin butchering and preparing fresh kosher meat. And so they stuck with eating dairy, and now we do the same on Shavuot to commemorate this practice. Also on Shavuot, the book of Ruth is read. Ruth was a Moabite who embraced Judaism, and her personal acceptance of the Jewish faith is considered comparable to the Israelites' communal acceptance of the Torah at Sinai. Before I continue, I have a few things before I get to my main sermon. I will begin, as is customary for certain poems on Shavuot. I have a Shavuot poem called Witnesses by Shmuel ben Moshe Halevi. 7 weeks after the Exodus from Egypt, 49 days after God passed over the firstborn of the Jewish people, the Lord appeared before his chosen, assembled at the foot of Mount Sinai, and took to himself his people, as a bridegroom takes his bride. And in token of this vow, to husband them, he gave unto the Jews not a ring, but the secret to a holy life, the living Torah. And every year, for 3,332 years now, on this day, the 6th day of Sivan, and today is the 7th, by the way, the chosen few re-accept the sacred Torah for every living Jew and every Jew that ever lived, and I could add, and all of those who accept the Messianic faith, is said to have been there in spirit with 600,000 on that awesome day, witnesses to the one and only living God. Blessed be he. I have a little Shavuot humor, just 2 short jokes before I move on to a beautiful little story. A couple of you could say, in honor of the practice of eating dairy on Shavuot, you could say these are a couple of cheesy Shavuot jokes. The first one is, what kind of man was Boaz before he married? And the answer is, he was ruthless. The second one is, who was the most flagrant lawbreaker in the Bible? It was Moses. He broke all 10 commandments at one time. So now that we've moved past the cheesy Shavuot jokes, I have a beautiful little story for you. It's called Shavuot, Torah, and Loving Kindness. Alan, I sure am excited about Shavuot, his friend Caleb said. So am I, Caleb. I stay up late into the night learning Torah with my father. Me too, Caleb said. It's really something to see the Beit Midrash, which is the study hall, packed at that hour. My father will be giving a Shavuot class. Really, Alan? Asked Caleb. What will he be speaking about? He will talk about the connection between the Megillah of Ruth, the scroll of Ruth, which we read on Shavuot, and also the holiday itself. I always wanted to know what the story of Ruth had in common with the giving of the Torah on Shavuot, asked Caleb. And Alan said to him, "Why don't you come to the class, Caleb?" And Caleb answered, "I think I will." Later that night, Alan's father began the class. He said, "I'm happy that all of you could join us this evening. Tonight we will be discussing the connection between the Megillah of Ruth and the holiday of Shavuot. Our story begins with a famine in the land of Israel. Elimelech was one of the wealthy men of the time, a supporter of many people. Due to the famine, poverty became rampant, and Elimelech did not want to support so many needy people who would beg for his help, and he decided to leave his homeland along with his family and stay in the land of Moab. And after a while, he decided to live there. That is when the problems began. Elimelech died. He passed away. His sons married Moabite women. They too passed away, leaving his wife Naomi and a widow with no children. And she became poverty-stricken and heartbroken. Naomi decided to return to her homeland, to the land of Israel. Her daughter-in-law, Ruth, and also her daughters-in-law, plural, Ruth and Orpah, were Moabite women. Moab was the son of Lot, the nephew of Abraham Avinu, Abraham our father. We know that Abraham was a man whose very essence was kindness. He spent his entire life doing acts of kindness for others, and that is why he was called to be the father of the faith. His descendants also had this character trait of kindness. However, Lot, his nephew, went to live in Sodom, a place where kindness was against the law. The trait of kindness became hidden, covered up, and eventually almost forgotten until it surfaced generations later in the person of Ruth, the Moabite. Ruth was a beautiful woman, the daughter of Eglon, king of Moab. She could have stayed in Moab and married a wealthy young man. Instead, she clung to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and returned with her to the land of Israel. Why did she do this? She saw Naomi's plight and empathized with her. She saw the truth of the Torah and was drawn to it. The trait of loving kindness, which had lain dormant for generations, was coming out. She later performed an even bigger act of kindness. She married an elderly man, Boaz, for the sake of Naomi's family. These two acts of self-sacrifice earned her a place in Israel's history. Not only that, but Ruth was King David's great-grandmother. And through her line would come Yeshua of Nazareth, the King of the Jews, Messiah of Israel, hope of all the world, and the Lord of loving kindness. Now, what does this have to do with receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai? What does all of this have to do with Shavuot? You see, the very essence of Torah, as he goes on in the class, is loving kindness. In order to receive Torah, one must prepare oneself. What sort of preparation is necessary? Being kind to others, becoming a compassionate, selfless, empathetic person. Only such a person can receive the depth and spirit of Torah. The story of Ruth can be an inspiration to all of us in our day and age. All Yeshua believers have that divine spark of kindness in their hearts. Sometimes that spark is covered by many layers of the pagan culture in which they are living. We should not be discouraged, however. The spark is always there. It just needs to be uncovered and brought back into its source. There it will grow into a flame, a fire of loving kindness, loving God, Torah, and all God's people. And back to our friends Alan and Caleb. Alan, that was so inspiring, said Caleb. I know now that when we help others, we are also helping ourselves and preparing ourselves to receive the Torah in its entirety this Shavuot. Let me go to my main sermon now. The first Shavuot was 7 weeks after the first Passover and the Exodus from Egypt. And traditionally, it marks God's giving of the Torah as detailed in Exodus 19 and 20. The first Shavuot after Yeshua's resurrection, as seen in Acts chapter 2, marked God's giving of the Ruach HaKodesh, or Spirit of Holiness. Both were about a covenant, a fire covenant, a blood covenant, one in law and the other in spirit. And a covenant is an agreement, like with Ruth's famous covenant in Ruth chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, as she spoke to Naomi. She said, "Don't press me to leave you. Don't stop me from following you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And may Adonai bring terrible curses upon me, and worse ones as well, if anything but death separates you and me." You see, in this way, Shavuot has been viewed as the wedding at Sinai. And in Judaism, the bride and groom have a marriage contract called the ketubah. And it's like the ketubah was given at Sinai in Exodus 19 and 20, and then signed by the Spirit in Acts chapter 2. And this brings us back to Ruth, the subject of our message today. You know, I think everybody likes to read a love story, especially if it's a true story. And the book of Ruth is such a story, if it's read at a superficial level and taken at its face value. It's got all the ingredients. There's a beautiful young girl who met a young man from another country. There's a tragedy because the young husband died, as well as his brother and his father. There's a mother-in-law, one of the best, I'd like to add. And there are tears on leaving their homeland. And there's another man who brought the young widow happiness. It's a great story. In fact, it's been called by some as the most beautiful story in the world. But there must be another reason that it's in the Bible. As people who are living today in the 21st century, we are positioned in time of the Messianic era. From this standpoint, we can see how God's dealings with his people Israel were foreshadowings of his intervention in human history. Let's see what, like the story of Ruth, can teach us today. Ruth is a Hebrew name that means companion. Some Jewish commentaries say that she was the daughter of Eglon, the king of Moab, and Eglon was the son of Balak, who's mentioned in the book of Numbers in the story of Balaam. But if that's true, if she was the daughter of King Eglon of Moab, then that would have made Ruth a princess. But if we're to understand the meaning of the actions of the main characters of this story, we have to go back into the ancient Hebrew culture. There we learn about the laws of redemption. If you owed a debt and you were unable to pay that debt, then you could be sold as a slave, and you would have to work off that obligation. Kind of like the idea of a person that has dinner in a restaurant, can't pay for it, and the old adage about the person having to wash all the dishes from the restaurant to pay for the dinner. But fortunately, there was another way out, because a member of your family could come along and pay the debt for you, and he would be called the Goel in Hebrew, which is the redeeming kinsman, because he had paid off your debt and redeemed you from that debt or that slavery. This principle of redemption also applied to property. In the founding years of Israel, it was important. It was an important feature in Adonai's provision for his people that property should remain within the family. Each family unit was given a portion of the land, and it was important that the family maintained that inheritance from generation to generation. So whenever land was sold, when the deed was drawn up, there was a clause whereby it specified that within a period of time, the property could be bought back by the original family. In other words, it could be redeemed. The person who accomplished this redemption was called the Goel, the redeeming kinsman. The principles behind the actions of the Goel are derived from God's redemptive action in delivering the newly emerging nation of Israel from Egyptian bondage and bringing it into the land of promise. It was an expression of his great love towards his chosen people, part of his covenant relationship. God had put it like this in Leviticus 26, verse 12. He says, "And I will walk among you, and I will be your God, and you will be my people." I will be your God, and you will be my people. Remember Ruth's covenant. Remember Ruth's statement, her famous words, her covenant words. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my people. In Leviticus 26, God is saying, I will be their God, and they will be my people. You see, that was God's plan and purpose for mankind, but what happened is that sin entered the world, bringing with it separation from God and the need for a Goel, a redeeming kinsman. So God made a provision for the greatest Goel through Yeshua. Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 6, he says, "In him we have redemption through his blood, the removal of trespasses." And now here in the book of Ruth, there is a classic example of this law of redemption. But to understand the significance of what Boaz did for Ruth, we have to sketch in a little of the background of the story. It happens something like this. It's the story of an Israeli couple living in Bethlehem who fell on hard times because of a severe drought. And they decided to move to the neighboring country of Moab. And they took with them their two boys who were quite frail. And they left behind them a field which they had owned. And the boys eventually married girls from Moab, a nation steeped in heathen, pagan practices. The move to Moab proved to be a complete, utter disaster for the family because first the husband, Elimelech, died, followed by the death of his two sons, leaving Naomi and her two daughters-in-law. What was she to do? Well, in the Lord, in Adonai's divine providence, Naomi hears from travelers from Israel that, quoting Ruth 1 verse 6, Adonai has taken note of his people and given them food. So she called her daughters-in-law and she says to them, I'm going home, but you can remain in Moab. But such was their love for Naomi that they insisted on returning to Israel with her. Eventually, one of the girls, Orpah, left her, but the other, Ruth, simply refused to leave Naomi. And she poured out of her heart the words of that covenant. As we heard earlier, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Ruth was prepared to step out into the unknown future, having put her faith in Naomi's God. That was the beginning of an adventure in trusting in God's provision. But that didn't mean that Naomi and Ruth could just sit back and expect gifts to drop down from heaven. Oh no. Ruth was willing to do whatever was necessary to get food. And remember for a second here, before we continue, that it is believed by the Jewish scholars of old that Ruth had been the daughter of the king of Moab. She would have been raised in a palace as a princess. And it gives some depth to the story of what happens. You see, these two widows, they owned a field in Bethlehem, but it may not have been cultivated, and they had to find some other means of supporting themselves. So Ruth set out to glean in the fields, to pick up what was left over after the guys came and harvested. They picked the crops and took them out, and she was allowed to go in and pick them up, whatever was left over. She offered to do it as part of her commitment to Naomi. There's something of a truth in the saying that heaven helps those who help themselves. And it so happened that they had returned to Israel at harvest time, and Ruth was able to take advantage of the generous provision of the laws of Israel that concerned the gleaning. The law required that reapers in the field should leave a portion of the crop to be collected by the needy. And if the reapers had missed a part of the field, they were not to go back to it later. It was all part of God's care for the poor, something we must constantly bear in mind when we celebrate in whatever life provides for us now. So Ruth went out into the fields to glean. This princess goes out to the fields, gets on her hands and her knees in the dirt, and begins to pick leftovers from the field. The story says that she happened to come to a field owned by a man named Boaz. What to Ruth was a sheer coincidence was part of God's plan. It was a work of God's hands. God's providence doesn't override human decision and action, but rather, as we live our lives open to his guidance, he works out his plans. We can picture Ruth now following these reapers, but before long, Boaz, the owner of the field, saw her. "Who's that?" he asks his foreman. When he heard who she was, he sent for her and said to her, Ruth 2 verse 11, he says, "I've heard of the marvelous things you've done for your mother-in-law." And he made it clear that she was very welcome and wished her a full reward from the God of Israel, under whose wings she had come to take refuge. That's right. The scripture says that she had been under the wings of God's refuge. But Boaz knew it was worthless wishing someone well and doing nothing about it when it was within his power to do something. So he told his foreman to look after her and make sure that bundles of corn were accidentally left behind for her to glean. And God expects us to translate our good intentions into action as well, often to be expressed in giving of our talents, our time, and our possessions. God's provision for us often comes through the generosity of others. And then we in turn are able to bless others. We have the responsibility of keeping that momentum going. Story is told of about a Native American Indian who was visiting New York City. And he turned to his friend in Times Square and he tilted his head and he said, "I hear a cricket." "You're crazy," his friend said. "No, I hear it," the Cherokee answered. And his friend replied, "It's rush hour. The city's full of noise and traffic, and you think you can hear a cricket?" "Yes," said the visitor. Then he walked over to a big cement planter outside the building, dug into the leaves underneath it, and pulled out the cricket. Turning to his friend, he said, "It all depends on what your ears are tuned to hear. Let me show you what I mean." And so the Cherokee reached down into his pocket. He pulled out a handful of change of coins, and he tossed it onto the pavement. And immediately, every head within earshot turned to see. See what I mean? He said, it all depends on what you are listening for. As in the case of Boaz, it often happens that the one who prays is in fact the one through whom it is answered. It is through Boaz himself that Ruth is to be given security, to find joy in a marriage, to have a new home and a new family. And if we belong to Messiah, then we are Adonai's covenant people. You see, when Ruth got home to Naomi, what a surprise she had for her. Naomi was quick to realize that the hand of God was upon them in their situation. You see, through Boaz, God's wings of refuge were already overshadowing them. God was there. God cares. God rules. And God provides. All they had to do was stay underneath the cover of his wings. In practical terms, though, Naomi told Ruth not to stray from the field that belonged to Boaz because he was now her benefactor. He didn't know it then, but he soon was to take on a greater role as her Goel. One can never tell what a single act of kindness under the hand of God can do. What will it lead to? Naomi certainly knew when Ruth was on to something good because she remembered that Boaz was a relation of her deceased husband, Elimelech, and so was qualified to take the place of her dead husband and so preserve the family. The unusual kindness shown by Boaz to Ruth must have set Naomi's heart and mind racing in planning the next steps of this romance, this love story. Naomi counseled Ruth to taking the opportunity to keep close to Boaz as the harvest workers camped together. And in the middle of the night, when everyone else was fast asleep, Ruth proposed to Boaz on the grounds that he was her Goel, he was her redeeming kinsman. It's a love story, and you should read it for yourself. And what did Boaz say in response to this proposal? Well, in all best traditions of a love story, he said, yes, yes, yes. However, there was a problem because there was another man who was a closer relation and so had first right of refusal. And Boaz gave his word that he would see what he could do. Boaz didn't waste time because the very next day, he went down to the city gate where contracts were made and publicly witnessed by the elders. And when the man who was nearest in line to Naomi came along, Boaz said he was acting for Naomi in the sale of her field, and if that man wanted to buy it, and if not, then he, Boaz, would redeem it. And the man said he would redeem it, but he changed his mind quickly when he heard that not only would he acquire the land, but a Moab wife too. This he couldn't do, as it would endanger his own estate, as the law said that in these circumstances, the firstborn son of the marriage would take Elimelech's name, and the inheritance would fall under that name and not his. But Boaz, in his love for Ruth, was willing to pay that price. Paying the price, paying that sacrifice. That's what redemption is all about. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9, he writes, "For you know how generous our Lord Yeshua the Messiah was. For your sakes he impoverished himself, even though he was rich, so that he might make you rich by means of his poverty." Yeshua is the supreme example of the Goel. Mankind as the first Adam is like the nearest kinsman, but couldn't save the human race, and it was left to the second Adam, the Messiah. Yeshua was willing to sacrifice not mere possessions, but his life in order to do so. Just as Boaz had that right of first refusal, the right of redemption, and yet was under no obligation, so it was with the Messiah, under no obligation, but yet he freely gave. That was an act of love. Redemption, the word means that something that was lost has been bought back. It means liberation, as setting a slave free. It means to deliver from some great danger. A new family has been created by the intervention of our Goel, Yeshua. Through him, we are adopted, all adopted into God's own family. And so, you see, the Ruth story here, the Ruth story is a love story in human terms. But it's also an illustration, a picture of the greatest love story in the world, God's love for us. The simple message of the good news is that if you've trusted Yeshua and you've come into a covenant relationship with him, then you belong to him and you have a future and you have a hope. And on the first Shavuot, the very first Shavuot, a thick, dark, powerful fire cloud covered Mount Sinai. And the whole mountain shook and trembled as the sound of a loud ram's horn, a trumpet, a shofar, split the air. God spoke and all of Israel heard his voice. And as the disciples of the risen Messiah gathered on Shavuot in Jerusalem, they gathered to celebrate the anniversary of the giving of the Torah. And for Yeshua's Talmudim, his disciples, the Shavuot miracles that accompanied the giving of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, in Acts chapter 2, allude to the giving of the Torah at Sinai, the mighty wind, the tongues of fire, the speaking in other languages. It marks the giving of God's Torah and his Spirit. This is the pure and the powerful and the eternal message of the Shavuot blood fire covenant. Adonai is our God, and we are his people. This is our marriage contract in Messiah, our membership agreement in God's kingdom, our blood covenant in Torah and in spirit. Adonai is our God, and we are his people. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Shavuot Sameach. Sabbath's peace to you all, and happy festival of Shavuot. God bless you all. I pray in the name of Yeshua the Messiah that the God of Israel, our Father in heaven, would rain down his blessings of healing and abundance and prosperity upon each of you in your homes and your families and your friends, your relations, all throughout this congregation and every other in this world. By the power of the blood of the Lamb, Yeshua the Messiah, in tongues of fire, in power, in spirit, and the blood covenant, because Adonai is our God, and we are his people. God bless you.